Darkness crept in early that evening. The city lights flickered before vanishing into an eerie void, plunging the neighborhood into an unnatural silence. The Thompson family sat huddled in their living room, their faces illuminated by candlelight. They had heard the reports, news anchors frantically warning people to stay indoors, desperate emergency broadcasts about a violent outbreak spreading through the city. But nothing had prepared them for what was about to unfold. James Thompson, the father, stood near the window, peeking through the blinds. His wife, Laura, sat on the couch clutching their youngest daughter, Emily, to her chest. Their teenage son, Kyle, had his phone gripped tightly, scrolling through social media, but the updates had stopped hours ago. No one was posting anymore. Then, a sound shattered the tense silence, a blood-curdling scream, followed by the unmistakable sound of flesh tearing and bones crunching. It came from just down the street. James' breath hitched as he saw their neighbor, Mr. Harris, staggering in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. His clothes were soaked in blood, his face twisted in agony. Behind him, a figure lurched forward, moving unnaturally, its head tilted at an odd angle. "Dad," Kyle's voice was barely above a whisper, but the sheer terror in it made James turn. "Look at this." He handed over the phone. A grainy video played, a man running, his phone shaking wildly. Behind him, inhuman creatures chased, their bodies mutilated but moving with terrifying speed. The video cut off abruptly. The caption read, "They don't stop. They don't feel pain. Lock your doors." James' grip tightened around the phone. A low growl outside made them all freeze. The front door rattled. Someone, or something, was out there. Laura clamped a hand over Emily's mouth to stifle her whimper. The rattling intensified, followed by guttural snarls. Then, a loud bang. The door shook violently. James grabbed the fireplace poker, motioning for Kyle to get behind him. They had no weapons, no plan. Just survival instincts in a house that suddenly felt too fragile. Another bang. Then, silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. James held his breath, waiting for the next impact. Instead, a bloodied hand slammed against the living room window, leaving behind a streak of red. Emily let out a muffled sob, and Laura held her tighter. "We need to leave," Kyle whispered, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." James wanted to argue, but deep down, he knew his son was right. If those things got inside, they wouldn't stand a chance. A distant explosion lit up the sky, followed by screams. The chaos was spreading. "Back door," James said, moving swiftly but quietly. "We go to the car. We drive. We find somewhere safe." They moved as one, creeping through the darkened house. James reached the back door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slowly turned the handle. Crash! The front window shattered, and a grotesque figure tumbled inside. Its milky eyes locked onto them. The rotting stench filled the air as it let out a guttural screech and lunged. "Go!" James yelled, shoving Kyle toward the back door. Laura dragged Emily, her grip firm as they stumbled outside into the cold night air. More figures moved in the shadows, drawn by the noise. James slammed the door behind him just as another creature lunged at it. The family sprinted toward their SUV parked in the driveway. James fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. Then, a scream. Laura turned just in time to see Emily being yanked backward by a pair of decayed hands. The child's terrified eyes met her mother's as the monster pulled her toward the darkness. "No!" Laura shrieked, running toward her daughter. James didn't think, he just acted. Swinging the fireplace poker with all his strength, he bashed the creature's head, the sickening crunch echoing in the night. Emily fell to the ground, sobbing, as James yanked her up. More of them were coming. Dozens. "Get in the car," he bellowed. Kyle flung the door open, and they piled inside. James jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Just as the creatures reached the vehicle, he stomped on the gas. The SUV plowed through the mass of undead, sending bodies flying. James gritted his teeth as he sped down the street, past burning houses and abandoned cars. Kyle turned in his seat, his face pale. "Dad, where do we go?" James didn't have an answer. The world had changed in a single night, and their only goal now was survival. As they drove into the unknown, the shadows of the dead stretched long behind them. James' hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the steering wheel. The SUV roared down the ruined street, headlights slicing through the night. The neighborhood they had once called home was now a war zone, houses burning, screams echoing, and shadows twisting in the darkness. The dead were everywhere. Laura clutched Emily, who was still sobbing, into her mother's chest. Kyle sat rigid in the front seat, his knuckles white as he held onto the dashboard. The weight of what had just happened pressed on all of them. "We need to get to the highway," James said, his voice tight. "We can't stay in the city." Kyle nodded, but his eyes flickered to the side mirror. "Dad, they're following us." James dared a glance. A dozen figures, some staggering, some unnervingly fast, were chasing the vehicle. Their flesh was torn, their eyes empty, but their hunger was relentless. "We won't let them catch us," James muttered, pressing harder on the gas. The SUV skidded around a corner, dodging an overturned police car. But just as they thought they had gained distance, a massive pileup blocked the road ahead, wrecked cars stacked haphazardly, some with doors flung open, others smeared with blood. A traffic jam frozen in time, filled with the remnants of what had once been people. James slammed the brakes, tires screeching. "Damn it!" Kyle twisted around, panic flaring in his eyes. "They're getting closer." James scanned the road. There was a narrow alley to the left, barely wide enough for the SUV. It was a gamble. But it was their only chance. "Hold on," he barked, jerking the wheel. The vehicle swerved violently, tires skimming the curb as they squeezed into the alleyway. Metal scraped against brick as the SUV's side mirror snapped off, but they made it through. Behind them, the horde crashed into the blockade, their inhuman screeches filling the night. Laura exhaled shakily. "Are we safe?" James didn't answer. "Not yet." They emerged onto a side street, the towering skyline of the city ahead now cast an eerie firelight. Smoke curled into the sky. Sirens wailed in the distance, but there were no police left to answer the calls. James pressed on, weaving through abandoned intersections. They had to get out before the entire city was overrun. Kyle scanned the buildings as they passed. "We need supplies. Food, water, weapons." James hesitated. Stopping was dangerous, but Kyle was right. They couldn't outrun this nightmare forever if they weren't prepared. Up ahead, a gas station loomed, its neon sign flickering erratically. The parking lot was littered with abandoned cars, but the entrance looked intact. James made a quick decision. "We'll stop, grab what we can, and go." Laura frowned. "Are you sure it's safe?" "Nothing is safe," he replied grimly. He pulled into the lot, engine idling. "Kyle, you're with me. Laura, stay with Emily and lock the doors. If anything happens." "I know," she cut in, gripping his arm. "Just come back." James nodded and grabbed a tire iron from under the seat. Kyle found a crowbar in the back. Armed with whatever they had, they stepped out into the silent night. The gas station was eerily still. The glass doors were cracked but unbroken. Fluorescent lights flickered inside. James pushed the door open slowly, the bell above jingling too loudly in the silence. Kyle held his breath. "Let's make this quick." They moved down the aisles, sweeping items into a duffel bag, bottled water, energy bars, canned food. James scanned the counter and spotted something useful. A baseball bat. Not a gun, but better than nothing. Then, shhhhhhk. A faint dragging sound. Kyle tensed. "Dad." James turned. Near the back of the store, just beyond the refrigerator doors, something moved. A figure twitched in the shadows. Its head tilted, lips curling back in a grotesque grin. Then, it lunged. James swung instinctively. The bat connected with a sickening thud, sending the creature sprawling. But it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from behind the aisles, their moans growing louder. Kyle gripped the crowbar. "We have to go." James didn't need convincing. He shoved Kyle toward the exit, kicking over a shelf to slow their pursuers. They burst out of the gas station, sprinting toward the SUV. Laura's horrified face was visible through the windshield. "Go! Go!" Kyle shouted. James threw the door open, practically diving inside. Kyle barely made it in before Laura hit the lock. Emily screamed as the creatures slammed against the windows. James jammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as he backed up. Then, he spun the wheel, accelerating out of the lot, leaving the monsters behind. Inside the SUV, their breaths came ragged. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, Laura turned to James. "Where do we go now?" James looked ahead. Beyond the city lay the dark stretch of the highway. "We find a place to hide," he said. "Before it's too late." As they drove toward the unknown, the city behind them continued to burn. The highway stretched ahead like a dark, empty abyss. The only light came from the SUV's headlights cutting through the night, illuminating the cracked asphalt littered with abandoned vehicles and scattered debris. The further they drove from the city, the quieter it became. No more sirens, no more screams. Just silence. But silence wasn't comforting. It felt like a warning. Kyle shifted uneasily in his seat. "Do you think anyone else made it out?" James gripped the wheel, eyes scanning the road. "Some must have." Laura, holding Emily close, whispered, "Then why haven't we seen anyone?" James had no answer. He didn't want to admit the truth, that the world they knew might already be gone. The gas station run had given them enough supplies to last a couple of days, but they needed somewhere safe to rest. James had hoped the highway would lead them to a safe zone, maybe a military blockade or an evacuation center. But the further they went, the less hopeful that seemed. Then, the gas gauge caught his eye. "Damn it," he muttered. Kyle noticed. "We're low?" "Less than a quarter tank." Laura frowned. "We just left the gas station." James sighed. "And barely made it out alive." "We'll have to stop again," Kyle said, though the idea clearly unsettled him. James nodded but kept driving, searching for a sign, a side road, anything that might lead them to shelter. Then, he spotted something ahead, a green highway sign barely illuminated by their headlights. "Rest stop, 2 miles." It wasn't ideal, but it was something. "Rest stop," James said. "We'll check if it's safe and figure out our next move." No one argued. The turnoff led them down a narrow road surrounded by dense trees. The SUV's headlights barely penetrated the darkness, making everything feel suffocating. When they finally pulled into the rest stop's parking lot, James shut off the engine. The silence was deafening. The small building looked intact, its windows dark. A few cars sat abandoned nearby, their doors hanging open. "I don't like this," Laura whispered. "We'll check it out," James said. "Kyle, with me." "Laura, stay with Emily." Laura's grip tightened around their daughter. "Be careful." James and Kyle stepped out, moving cautiously toward the rest stop entrance. The air was thick, carrying the scent of decay. James tightened his grip on the baseball bat, Kyle raising his crowbar. The door creaked as James pushed it open. Inside, the place was eerily still. The vending machines were shattered, their contents long gone. A few chairs lay overturned, and dried blood stained the tiled floor. Kyle shivered. "Think someone's still here?" James moved carefully, checking each corner. Then, a noise. A faint shuffle from the restroom hallway. James motioned for Kyle to stay back. He edged forward, raising the bat. The door to the men's restroom was slightly ajar. A shadow moved inside. James took a breath, then kicked the door open. A man stumbled out, eyes wild, face gaunt with hunger and fear. He wasn't infected, at least, Not yet. Please, he rasped. Help me. Kyle lowered his weapon. He's alive. James steadied himself. Are you hurt? The man shook his head rapidly. No. No bites. I swear. His voice trembled. I was traveling with my family. We stopped here. We thought it was safe. Kyle's stomach twisted. Where are they? The man swallowed hard. Gone. They turned. I locked myself in the bathroom. I don't know how long I've been in there. James glanced around. Are there more of them? The man nodded, eyes darting to the shadows. They're still here. A guttural moan echoed from deeper in the building. James stiffened. Time to go. But before they could move, the first figure emerged from the darkness. Then another. And another. Shambling, rotting, hungry. Kyle's breath hitched. Dad. James grabbed the man by the arm and shoved him toward the exit. Run. They sprinted toward the SUV. Laura saw them coming, eyes widening in horror at the creatures spilling out of the building. James threw the door open, pushing the man inside. Go, go! Kyle barely had time to jump in before James slammed the gas. The tires screeched as they peeled out of the parking lot, leaving the dead behind. Inside the car, everyone was gasping for breath. The man sat shaking in the back seat. Thank you, he stammered. I thought I was dead. James kept his eyes on the road. What's your name? Eric, the man managed. Laura hesitated, glancing at James. They had barely escaped, and now they had another mouth to feed. James knew what she was thinking. But what choice did they have? We keep moving, he said. Because now we know the truth. Kyle looked at him. What truth? James exhaled. Nowhere is safe. As they drove into the night, the trees seemed to whisper around them, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. The road stretched endlessly into the night. The SUV's headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the eerie silence weighed on everyone inside. The city was far behind them now, but the danger wasn't. Eric, the man they had rescued, sat hunched in the back seat, his fingers trembling against his knees. Laura watched him cautiously, still gripping Emily, who had finally dozed off in her lap. Kyle, sitting beside Eric, kept shifting uncomfortably, clearly unsure of whether to trust him. James kept his focus on the road. Every now and then, he glanced at the fuel gauge. It was creeping closer to empty. How far are we from the next town? Kyle finally asked, breaking the silence. James exhaled. Hard to say. Maybe an hour, if the roads are clear. Eric's voice was weak. There's a small town up ahead. I passed through it before everything went to hell. James tensed. Did you see any survivors? Eric shook his head. No. Just bodies. And those things. Laura frowned. Then why would we go there? Because we don't have a choice, James said, tapping the fuel gauge. We need gas, food, shelter. If we don't stop, we'll run out in the middle of nowhere. Kyle glanced back at Eric. Are you sure you're not bitten? Eric turned to him, his expression pained. I told you, I'm not. Silence fell again, but the tension in the car was thick. Emily stirred in her sleep, her tiny voice mumbling, Mommy. Laura stroked her hair. Shoo, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. James' grip tightened on the wheel. He had promised himself one thing since this nightmare began: he would protect his family at any cost. But now, with a stranger in the car and nowhere truly safe, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep that promise. 30 minutes later. The town appeared on the horizon, barely visible in the weak glow of the moon. It was small, just a handful of buildings, a gas station, a diner, and what looked like a grocery store. James slowed the SUV to a crawl. The place was dead. Cars were abandoned along the road, doors open, belongings scattered. A few bodies lay motionless, some covered in blood, others eerily untouched. Kyle swallowed hard. This is creepy as hell. James parked at the edge of the town. We go in fast. We take what we need, and we get out. Laura hesitated. What if it's not empty? James turned to her. Then we fight. She didn't like that answer, but she nodded. Eric cleared his throat. I can help. James studied him for a long moment. He wasn't sure he trusted him yet, but an extra pair of hands could make a difference. Fine, James said. Kyle, you're with me. Eric, stay with Laura and Emily. If anything happens, you honk the horn. Got it? Eric nodded. Got it. James and Kyle stepped out, weapons in hand. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the silence felt unnatural. Every step they took echoed too loudly. They moved toward the gas station first. The doors were shattered, glass crunching beneath their boots. Inside, the shelves were mostly empty, but there were still a few useful items: bottled water, canned goods, batteries. They grabbed everything they could. Then, Kyle spotted something behind the counter. Dad, a gun. James turned. A shotgun lay abandoned near a blood-stained register. He picked it up carefully. It was heavy, loaded. Now we're talking, Kyle whispered. James shoved extra shells into his bag. Then, a noise. Something shifted near the storage room. James and Kyle froze. A low growl came from behind the door. James motioned for Kyle to move. Slowly. Don't make a sound. Kyle backed toward the exit. But as he did, his foot hit a fallen can. Clang. The growl turned into a snarl, and the storage room door burst open. A figure lunged out, a woman, her eyes milky white, mouth twisted into a feral grin. She was fast. Too fast. James barely had time to react before she was on him. Kyle screamed. Dad! James raised the shotgun, boom. The blast echoed through the town. The creature collapsed, but the noise had drawn attention. From the street, a chorus of growls answered. Oh, no, Kyle breathed. James grabbed the bag and ran. Move! They bolted out of the gas station just as figures began to emerge from the shadows. Laura's terrified voice came from the car. James! He and Kyle sprinted toward the SUV as the undead swarmed from alleyways and open doors. Eric had already jumped into the driver's seat. Start the car! James yelled. Eric fumbled with the keys, but his hands were shaking. The first creature reached the car, slamming against the window. James yanked the passenger door open and threw the bag inside. Kyle dove in after him. Drive! James shouted. Eric slammed his foot on the gas. The SUV screeched forward, mowing down a few of the monsters. Laura clutched Emily, trying to keep her calm, but the child was screaming. James turned to Eric. What the hell took you so long? Eric's face was pale. I panicked. Kyle clenched his fists. If you freeze up like that again, we're dead. James exhaled sharply, trying to steady his pulse. They had gotten supplies, a weapon, but now they had nowhere to go. And as he looked at the fear on his wife's face, the confusion in his son's eyes, and the way Eric trembled beside them, James realized something terrifying. His family wasn't just fighting the undead. They were starting to fall apart. And in this world, a fractured family wouldn't survive for long. The SUV sped down the desolate highway, the tension inside the vehicle nearly as suffocating as the darkness outside. No one spoke for the first few miles. The distant moans of the undead faded behind them, but their presence lingered in everyone's mind. James' knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He had been forced to make tough calls before, but every decision felt heavier now. They had supplies, a weapon, and barely enough gas to keep moving, but no real destination. Emily stirred in Laura's arms, her tiny voice breaking the silence. Are we safe now? Laura ran her fingers through Emily's hair, her voice soft but uncertain. "We're safe, sweetheart." But James knew that was a lie. They were never safe. Kyle, sitting in the front seat, turned his head slightly. "Where are we even going?" James exhaled, trying to push away his frustration. "Somewhere away from the cities. Maybe we can find an empty house, a cabin, somewhere we can hold out." Eric shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. "We won't last long without more fuel." Kyle shot him a glare. "Oh, so now you have something to say? You almost got us killed back there." Eric flinched. I panicked." Kyle scoffed. "Yeah, we noticed." "Enough." James' voice was firm, though exhaustion weighed on it. "We can't turn on each other." Kyle didn't respond, but the tension remained thick. Eric hesitated before speaking again. "I know a place." James glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "What place?" Eric sat up a little. "Before everything collapsed, I passed through a small hunting lodge about an hour from here. It's isolated. Might have supplies. Maybe even a generator." Laura's expression remained wary. "And you didn't mention this before?" Eric sighed. "Would you have trusted me if I had?" James clenched his jaw. He didn't like this, didn't like trusting a stranger. But he had no better plan. "Fine," he said. "Tell me where to go." An hour later. The road turned into a narrow dirt path, lined with trees that loomed in the darkness like silent sentinels. The SUV's headlights barely cut through the thick fog rolling in from the hills. "This is it," Eric said, pointing ahead. A cabin sat nestled between the trees, its windows dark and lifeless. The structure looked old, but sturdy. A large barn stood off to the side, its doors slightly ajar. James stopped the SUV a few yards away. "We go in carefully." Kyle grabbed the shotgun. "If this is a trap, I swear." "It's not," Eric said, though his voice lacked confidence. James stepped out first, gripping his baseball bat. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. He motioned for Kyle to follow. Laura stayed in the car with Emily, but her grip tightened on a kitchen knife she had taken from the gas station. If anything happened, she would fight. The two men moved toward the cabin, each step crunching against gravel. James reached the front door and pushed it open. The inside was musty, but empty. Dust covered the wooden floors, and the air smelled of old firewood. Kyle moved cautiously, scanning each corner. No bodies. That's a good sign. James checked the kitchen. A few cabinets were still stocked with canned food. Not much, but enough to last a few days. Then he heard it. A thud. Kyle stiffened. That came from the barn. James' heartbeat quickened. "We check it. Then we decide if we stay." The barn. The large wooden doors creaked as James pushed them open. The smell of hay and rusted metal filled the air. Something moved. James froze, raising the bat. Kyle gripped the shotgun tightly. Then, a figure stepped into the dim light. It was a man. Alive. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt with exhaustion. He raised his hands slowly, his eyes darting between them. "Please, don't shoot," he rasped. James narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The man swallowed hard. "My name is Carter. I was part of a group that came through here a few days ago. But they didn't make it." Kyle's grip tightened. "Did they turn?" Carter shook his head. "No. They were killed." James frowned. "By what?" Carter hesitated. "Not what. Who?" James' stomach dropped. Kyle exhaled sharply. "Great. So now we have to deal with people trying to kill us too." Carter stepped forward. "This place was a safe house. But a group of raiders found us. They took supplies. Killed anyone who resisted. I hid in here, waited until they left." James processed the information quickly. If raiders knew about this place, they might come back. He turned to Kyle. "We're leaving." Kyle nodded. But then, a gunshot cracked through the night. From the SUV, Emily screamed. James spun toward the car, his stomach twisting. Then he saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, carrying weapons. Men. Not the undead. The raiders were back. "Run!" James shouted. But it was too late. The gunshot echoed through the night, followed by Emily's terrified scream. James' heart pounded as he sprinted toward the SUV, his grip tightening on the bat. Kyle was right behind him, shotgun raised. Laura had already pulled Emily down into the back seat, shielding her as the raiders emerged from the trees. At least 5 of them, armed with rifles and machetes, moving like predators who had just spotted easy prey. Eric ducked behind the SUV, eyes wide with terror. "They found us." James barely registered his words, his only thought was reaching his family before it was too late. A gruff voice called out from the darkness. Well, looks like we got ourselves some fresh meat." A man stepped forward, his face partially hidden beneath a hood. He held a rifle lazily in his hands, as if he wasn't even concerned. The others fanned out, surrounding the vehicle. James skidded to a halt, raising his bat. Kyle aimed the shotgun, his hands shaking but steady enough. Carter, the man they had just met in the barn, held up his hands. I had nothing to do with this," he stammered. "I was hiding." One of the raiders cracked him across the face with the butt of a rifle. Carter crumpled to the ground. James clenched his jaw. He knew the type, these weren't just looters. They were killers. "Look," James said, keeping his voice calm. "We don't want trouble. Just let us take our family and leave." The leader chuckled. "Oh, you don't want trouble? That's cute. See, you're sitting on our supplies. And you killed some of our guys back in town." James didn't flinch. "Your guys were already dead. The infected got them." The leader shrugged. "Doesn't really matter, does it? You took what's ours. And now," he gestured to his men, "we take what's yours." James' muscles tensed. He could feel Kyle shifting beside him, ready to fire, but they were outnumbered. A gunfight would get them all killed. One of the raiders took a step toward the SUV, grinning. "Maybe we start with the lady and the kid." Laura's eyes widened. She hugged Emily tighter. James saw red. Without thinking, he moved fast. The baseball bat swung in a blur, connecting with the raider's skull with a sickening crack. The man crumpled. And just like that, chaos erupted. The fight for survival. Kyle fired first. The shotgun roared, sending another raider sprawling backward. The remaining 3 scrambled, momentarily caught off guard. Eric, still crouched behind the SUV, yelped in panic. Carter, blood dripping from his split lip, scrambled away from the attackers. James swung again, but the leader was quicker. He sidestepped, then drove a knee into James' gut, knocking him back. Laura threw open the SUV door, shielding Emily as she grabbed the knife from her bag. The leader turned to Kyle, raising his rifle. Click. Empty. Kyle didn't hesitate, he tackled the man to the ground. The 2 struggled, fists flying. Eric finally moved, grabbing a rock and smashing it into another raider's face. The man howled, staggering backward. James recovered just in time to see the leader pin Kyle down, his hands closing around Kyle's throat. "No!" James lunged, slamming his bat across the leader's ribs. Kyle gasped for air and kicked him off. James raised the bat for a finishing blow. But then, a loud, guttural moan echoed through the trees. Everyone froze. Then another moan. And another. Shadows emerged from the tree line. The gunshots had drawn them. Dozens of them. The undead. The real enemy arrives. The raiders turned, realizing their mistake. "Shit," one of them started to say, but he didn't get to finish. A decayed figure lunged at him, sinking rotting teeth into his throat. Blood sprayed as the man collapsed, screaming. The other raiders tried to fight, but the undead swarmed too quickly. James grabbed Kyle's arm. "To the car, now!" Kyle didn't argue. Laura was already inside, Emily sobbing into her chest. James and Kyle shoved Eric and Carter toward the SUV. More zombies poured from the woods, drawn by the chaos, the scent of fresh blood. The leader of the raiders staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage. He aimed his rifle at James. Before he could fire, a zombie latched onto his back, sinking its teeth into his shoulder. His screams were lost in the growing horde. James threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas. The SUV roared forward, plowing through the undead. Bodies hit the hood, rolling off as the vehicle tore down the road. Inside, everyone was breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through them. Kyle stared out the window, watching as the burning lodge disappeared behind them, the undead feasting on what remained of the raiders. Laura held Emily tightly, whispering, "It's over, it's over." But James knew better. It wasn't over. It was only getting worse. The SUV tore down the darkened road, its headlights slicing through the fog. Inside, no one spoke. Only the sounds of their ragged breathing and Emily's muffled sobs filled the space. James' hands were locked onto the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The image of the raiders being torn apart played over and over in his mind. They had been lucky, too lucky. If the undead hadn't arrived when they did, his family would have been slaughtered. But now, the real question remained, where do we go next? Kyle finally broke the silence. "We can't keep running forever." James exhaled, his grip tightening. "I know." Eric, still shaken from the attack, rubbed his face. "There's gotta be somewhere safe. A military base, a bunker, something." James glanced at him through the rearview mirror. If those places still existed, we'd have seen signs of them by now. Laura, her arms wrapped around Emily, looked out the window at the endless stretch of road. "Then what do we do? We're running out of gas. We have food for maybe 2 days. We can't just keep driving until the tank runs dry." No one had an answer. Then, thump thump thump. A sudden noise from the SUV's undercarriage. James frowned. The steering felt off. Kyle tensed. What was that? James slowed the car slightly, listening. The sound came again, a deep, unsettling clunking from beneath them. And then, bang! The SUV jolted violently to the right. James fought for control, but the front tire had blown. The vehicle swerved, skidding across the cracked pavement before slamming to a stop in the middle of the road. Silence. For a moment, no one moved. Emily whimpered. "Daddy." James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "It's okay, sweetheart." But it wasn't. They were stranded. Trapped in the open. James and Kyle stepped out first, weapons drawn. The night was deathly quiet. No moans, no movement, just the eerie stillness of a world that had already died. James crouched near the front of the car, running his fingers over the shredded rubber of the front tire. Damn it, we must have hit something back near the lodge. Kyle exhaled sharply. We have a spare, right? James nodded. Yeah, but it's gonna take time to change it. And if something's out here... A sound in the distance made them both freeze. A low, guttural growl. Then another. From the trees. Kyle swallowed hard. Dad. James stood up slowly, scanning the darkness. The fog made it impossible to see far, but the sounds were unmistakable. They weren't alone. James turned to the SUV. Laura. Get Emily ready to run. Laura's eyes widened. Run? Where? James' heart pounded as the growls grew louder. Shadows moved in the fog, figures stumbling forward, drawn by the sound of their accident. James looked down the road. A mile ahead, barely visible through the mist, a highway overpass stretched across the landscape. It might be abandoned, or it might be their only chance. There. He pointed. We go on foot. Kyle grabbed the shotgun. What about the car? James didn't hesitate. We leave it. Eric cursed under his breath. We can't just abandon it. James cut him off. If we stay here, we die. Laura unbuckled Emily, grabbing her tightly. We have to move now. Eric hesitated, but one look at the approaching figures changed his mind. They ran. The chase. The first undead reached the SUV just as they cleared the road. Kyle turned back, raising the shotgun. I got this. James yanked him forward. No. Don't waste ammo. We keep moving. Kyle clenched his jaw but obeyed. The fog thickened as they ran, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Emily clung to Laura, burying her face in her mother's shoulder to block out the horror behind them. James' legs burned as he pushed forward. The overpass was closer now, looming over them like a massive concrete skeleton. Eric panted beside him. What if there's more of them up there? James didn't have an answer. He just knew they had no other option. Then, a scream. Laura. James spun around, just in time to see a decayed hand gripping Laura's jacket, pulling her backward. Laura screamed again, trying to hold on to Emily. James moved without thinking. He swung his bat with everything he had, crack, shattering the infected skull. The creature crumpled, but more were right behind it. Kyle fired the shotgun. Boom! Another one dropped. Go! James shouted. They scrambled forward, feet pounding against the pavement. The entrance to the overpass was just ahead. A wrecked pickup truck blocked most of the path, but there was just enough space to squeeze through. James shoved Laura and Emily forward first. Eric followed, then Kyle. James was last, sliding through just as the undead reached the wreckage. For a moment, they were safe. The infected slammed into the truck, clawing and snarling but unable to reach them. James collapsed against the concrete wall, breathing hard. They had made it. For now. What lies ahead? As they caught their breath, James scanned the overpass. It stretched into the darkness, littered with abandoned cars and debris. Laura held Emily tightly, her body still trembling. Kyle wiped sweat from his forehead. What now? James exhaled. We search the cars. Find food, water, weapons. We rest. Eric shook his head. For how long? We need a real plan. James turned to him, his expression grim. First, we survive the night. Eric didn't argue. As they moved deeper onto the overpass, the weight of their situation settled in. They were still running. Still fighting. And tomorrow, they would have to do it all over again. Because in this world, there was no finish line. Only survival. The overpass stretched out in eerie silence, the abandoned cars like tombstones in a graveyard of a forgotten world. The wind howled through gaps in the broken concrete, carrying the distant moans of the undead below. James led the group forward, gripping his bat tightly. His legs ached, his mind was exhausted, but he had no choice but to keep moving. Emily clung to Laura, her tiny hands shaking. Are we safe here, Mommy? Laura forced a smile, though her eyes betrayed the truth. For now, sweetheart. Kyle checked the shotgun, counting their remaining shells. Only 4 left. He sighed. Not enough. James scanned the nearby vehicles. We searched the cars. Weapons, food, anything useful. Eric frowned. And if there's nothing? James met his gaze. Then we find another way to survive. The group split up, checking each vehicle. Most were either locked or had been looted long ago. Cracked windshields, dried bloodstains, and half-eaten corpses were all that remained of those who had died here. Carter, still nursing the injuries from his scuffle with the raiders, limped toward a rusted sedan. Hey, found something. James approached, peering inside. A backpack sat on the passenger seat. He smashed the window carefully, reaching inside. Inside the bag, a half-empty water bottle. 2 cans of beans. A box of bullets, but for the wrong gun. A lighter. Better than nothing, James muttered, handing the food and water to Laura. Kyle, searching a nearby truck, called out. "Ah, guys?" They turned. He was staring into the back seat of a minivan. James walked over, following his gaze. His stomach twisted. Inside, 2 figures sat motionless, a man and a woman, their hands entwined. Their skin was pale, their bodies unmoving. A pistol rested in the man's lap, a single bullet hole through both their skulls. A mercy killing. Emily, still holding on to Laura, peeked over. "Are they sleeping?" Laura gently turned her away. "Come on, baby. Let's keep moving." Kyle exhaled sharply. Guess they figured it was better than turning. James didn't respond. He just took the pistol from the man's lap. 2 bullets left. Not much. But something. A terrifying discovery. They set up a temporary camp near an overturned truck, using it as cover. The undead were still snarling at the edge of the overpass, unable to climb up. Eric sat with his head in his hands. "We can't stay here. The moment more show up, we're done." James nodded. "We move at first light." Kyle was keeping watch near the edge when he stiffened. We might have a problem." James walked over. "What is it?" Kyle pointed down the road. James followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold. Silhouettes. Moving. Not zombies. People. Armed. James grabbed his bat, his instincts screaming. "Raiders?" Kyle squinted. "Not sure. But they're coming this way." James acted quickly. "Everyone! Get low, hide behind the cars." They scrambled for cover. Laura held Emily tightly, whispering for her to stay quiet. The figures moved closer. James counted at least 7. They weren't just passing through. They were searching. For something. For someone. James' heart pounded. If they were raiders, they'd kill the men and take whatever supplies they had, including Laura and Emily. A voice rang out in the night. "I know you're here." James clenched his jaw. The leader stepped forward, a man in tattered military gear, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "You were at the lodge," he continued. "We saw what you did." Kyle shot James a look. They were watching. The man took another step. "You made a mistake, killing my men." James tightened his grip on the bat. The man smiled darkly. "But don't worry. We'll make sure you pay for it." A second later, the first gunshot rang out. The final stand. The bullet shattered the windshield of a nearby car, missing James by inches. "Run," he shouted. Kyle fired back, hitting one of them in the chest. The man collapsed. James grabbed Laura's hand, pulling her and Emily toward the far side of the overpass. They weaved between cars as bullets whizzed past them. Eric tripped, falling behind. "Wait." A second shot rang out. Eric gasped, clutching his stomach as blood soaked his hands. Carter tried to drag him forward, but another shot dropped him instantly. James didn't have time to grieve. They reached the edge of the overpass, only to find themselves trapped. A 50-foot drop below. Kyle looked back. "We're boxed in." James scanned the area. There, an old maintenance ladder leading down the side. "Go," he ordered. Laura hesitated, clutching Emily. "James." He grabbed her face, pressing his forehead against hers. "I love you. Now go." Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she obeyed. She climbed down first, holding Emily tightly. Kyle followed, shotgun slung over his back. James turned to cover them. The raiders advanced, guns raised. The leader smirked. Last chance. Come quietly. James didn't let him finish. He raised the pistol from the minivan and fired. The leader jerked back as the bullet struck his shoulder. James turned and leapt onto the ladder, sliding down just as more bullets slammed into the railing. They hit the ground running. Laura led the way into the woods, gripping Emily as she sobbed into her mother's chest. Kyle stayed at the back, reloading. They're coming. James pushed forward, adrenaline keeping him upright. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. The raiders weren't giving up. Then, a deep, guttural howl echoed through the trees. James froze. Not a zombie. Something else. The raiders stopped too, their guns lowering. Another howl. James' stomach twisted. He had heard stories of things worse than zombies. Mutations. The creatures that came after the infection. Kyle's voice was barely a whisper. Tell me that's not what I think it is. James didn't answer. He just grabbed Laura's hand and pulled her forward. Whatever was in those woods. They were about to find out. End of Part 8.